For those of us who have grown up in India, we were introduced to the concept of segregation and apartheid very early on, as we were taught about the discrimination Gandhi faced while living in South Africa and how that marked the beginning of the independence movement in India. With the support of the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, we speak to land and housing activist Adi Kumar about the history of apartheid in South Africa and how those land policies continue to affect the supply of affordable housing in Cape Town today. I am Vaissnavi Shukla, and this is Architecture of Center, a podcast where we highlight contemporary discourses that shape the built environment but do not occupy the center stage in our daily lives. We speak to radical designers, thinkers, and change makers who are deeply engaged in redefining the way we live and interact with the world around us. Adi, since this season we are looking broadly at the themes of home, house, housing, shelter, very broadly. One often historically speaking, when you look at architectural texts and the evolution of how one came to designing and living inside a home, the most primitive form of it is always a shelter, the typical diagram that you know of the wooden trusses with like a little pitch roof on top, and you always see them being used interchangeably, maybe not as frequently interchanged as home and house, because home is something personal, house is, just somebody else's, but they carry very different meanings. Now, in your experience, how do you differentiate between the two, especially legally speaking? How does law differentiate shelter, house, home?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. And like you said, like the home has many connotations, from the feeling of kind of safety and security, feeling of being with family, community, cultural representation. So often our imagination around the home, like you describe, is very often the brick and mortar, the cement and concrete, or, the classic kind of pitched roof house that kids draw. And, in many ways, it draws its inspiration from kind of even fairy tales, like the story of the three pigs and the wolf. I huff and I puff and I blow your house in. And ultimately, the house that survives and the house that gets recognition is the one that's made of brick and mortar. The house that made of hay, gets blown in. The house made of wood gets blown in. So this idea of like a proper home, a brick home, a pakka home is really what defines in many people's imagination what a home stands for. But in many ways, people who live in inadequate shelter define it with a sense of inadequacy, the lack of compliance, the lack of appropriate material, the lack of services, and defining anyone's home as inadequate. So in a way, the normative definition of a home, and you're absolutely right, has a dramatic impact on how we understand society, how we understand housing rights, how people's housing decisions are structured, how the market works, and eventually how even things like homelessness are addressed. So to the question of kind of legal definitions, there are kind of two ways in which generally kind of the international community will describe a home. So the first, all of this is under the broad umbrella of inadequacy. The first is around kind of regular occupation, which is coupled with some degree of permanence, which means that regular occupation means you have some possessions in it, you have some, those kind of items that everyday use are belonging there. And then the second idea that links to this idea of permanence, whether a person has lived there for a specific duration. And both of these in conjunction really give a kind of legal definition of what a home could be. So for instance, in South Africa, in one of the litigation cases, the courts have been very broad about the definition of a home. They say it doesn't matter whether you live in a tent or a plastic sheet or a brick house. A home is where a person sleeps and rests his body at night and feels safe. So in many ways, it broadens this idea of home outside of its materiality and its permanence. In a very kind of simplistic way, trying to define it would be any completed structure made of any material that appears to be capable of performing the function of a shelter and dwelling should be regarded as someone's home. And so I think in many ways, this ambiguity of what a home is uh, creates complications, because if a home does not have a bed, if it's unoccupied shelter, often is used as an excuse to evict people. So in legal terms, it allows both flexibility for people to inhabit in ways which are suitable to their current living conditions or current economic conditions, but also is used and weaponized when it comes to issues of evictions and forced removals.
Mm. I thought I lost you for a second, but I think we're back on. Adi, are you able to hear me? I thought I lost you for a second, but I think we're back on. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So, if I were to probe you a little bit, and if we just try to think this out loud, so in a purely kind of mathematical Venn diagram situation, would you say that the home falls into the category of a shelter, but not necessarily vice versa? Because a shelter could be anything that gives a certain kind of protection or coverage to an individual. So maybe a home is a shelter, but a shelter is not necessarily a home because you could be seeking refuge in an office building, in foyers of residential buildings or hotels or supermarkets. And do all those places of refuge then become shelters? But it is only the function and the utility and the emotional, sentimental part of it that sets the home apart. I'm just probing this a little bit
Yes.
so that then we can get into very context specific questions.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I think you're right. The home is about identity. It's about personal and familial identity or community identity and so on. And it's quite distinctive from this idea of shelter, because like you described, like a shelter is has myriad of meanings and could be very different things in different contexts. So in many ways, the you know the feeling of home comes with with what you carry with you and the people that you carry with you. So I think that sense is very important in making that distinction between the two.
Mm. Now, you've been living and working in South Africa for a while, and I thought we could get into more specific questions. So, race and religion, of course, everybody who's from India has known about the history of race and religion in India because of Mahatma Gandhi, and because how he was pushed out of South Africa, moved back to India, and started the whole freedom struggle. So, race and religion, of course, were historically used to forcibly remove people in South Africa, and also created racially segregated ghettos. And ghettoization, again, is something that people in urban planning, urban design use very frequently and very sparingly now. How does this history continue to shape the specifically the housing landscape in South Africa today? And if you can speak a little bit about the long-term effects that this segregation has had on the urban fabric, and if you could speak to the current situation a little bit.
That's a complicated question to answer. I think in most planning education, including my own education, like land use planning is sort of taught as a technical science, in a way that, if you understand the demographic trends, if you understand the economic trends, there's a degree of prediction. You're able to say that if these actions are done, this will lead to certain outcomes and so on. And we know that that hasn't worked in many of the global south cities. Like the outcomes aren't predetermined through land use planning and so on. What I missed in my education, and perhaps in many other people's education, is the deep influence of kind of land use planning and politics in determining how the city is structured and how that
Mm.
can be used as a way of advancing colonial practices, of segregation, of separation, of creating ghettos, and all of those kind of things. So in many ways, a lot of the kind of colonial practice of planning is around segregation. Whether you take India, whether you take South Africa, or many other countries, the practice has been how do we segregate people and differentiate people based on the basis of race, religion, sometimes around caste, sometimes around gender, and all of these things are implemented and institutionalized through town planning and city planning. So in most of the colonized countries, we'll see that segregation comes with a large degree of dispossession of land and property. And South Africa is no different than that. South Africa, despite it being a democratically adopted system, experienced a political system that used planning as an instrument for segregation and separation. So the Group Areas Act was instituted with the culture of separating people across race. So whites mostly in predominantly well-located areas, uh, and blacks, coloreds, and Indians in townships, often in dormitory style townships, living in really poor and inadequate conditions in most of the time. So this was enacted through kind of planning laws, which allowed and gave the state to power to dispossess people of land that they were residing on and move them into areas that were poorly serviced, that didn't have the adequate amenities, that didn't have schools, education facilities, hospitals, or any of the other community amenities that people would need. So it created a spatial pattern in the city and a spatial fabric in the city, which was built on keeping people apart and keeping these cultural identities apart and the racial identities apart. So poor and working class people were forced into these ghettos and created a very inadequate environment for people to make their community and imbibe their community in that particular neighborhood. So what happens 30 years after apartheid ended in South Africa particularly and in most South African cities, that despite the very strong narrative of trying to remove the spatial apartheid and the spatial segregation, the spatial segregation has only grown in the last 30 years. And so it really brings into question like why the planning systems that are intended to do exactly the opposite. They're supposed to integrate communities across class and race are unable to enact those systems in the city. So a number of factors have contributed to this piece. The one of the main factors is the way the property market was structured. So while
Mm.
a lot of the issues around land were addressed as part of the democratic dispensation, no real redistribution of land took place, which meant that a lot of people that were living in townships and peripheral areas of the city continued to live there without ever having access to the inner city to live in. So what we see currently in a place like, for instance, like Cape Town, you'll see that most of the people are living in either informal settlements or tiny 40 square meter houses on the periphery of the city, and often commuting 40 square meters to come into the economic center of the city, earn their income, spending about 40% of their income, on commuting, and then end up traveling back, spending about 4 hours every day commuting between their place of residence and where they work. So in many ways, this transformation hasn't happened because of the way the market logic has played itself out. So the planning regime has really reinforced and in fact perpetuated and made worse a lot of the kind of intentions of spatial planning in South Africa has been, which is to integrate and remove the kind of spatial segregation. So sadly, I think this paramount question has also led to a number of other pieces of regulatory issues that have shaped the way land is managed. So, for many years, people could occupy land and people could build their own homes and could use the housing policy in South Africa to use land in a way that's productive for them. But that situation has changed as land is becoming more and more limited and more expensive, leading to fairly destructive evictions that are taking place across the board. So beside it being sort of like a humiliating experience of people experiencing an eviction, it is also leading to this idea that very little has changed in those ways from pre-apartheid to post-apartheid South Africa, because if forced removals were allowed during the apartheid regime, then very similar types of forced removals and illegal evictions are being enacted by a democratic dispensation. So in a way, I think this conundrum of how do we change the planning regime to allow for a different way of thinking about land, both in terms of private property, but also in terms of how the state owns and controls its own land.
Mm,
So we have, many countries across the world that, especially particularly local governments and national governments, own massive amounts of land, and very little has been done in economically viable areas, in well-serviced areas, to transform some of these things.
mm,
The last piece that I would say in terms of kind of the long term is that despite 30 years, there hasn't been a single affordable housing unit that's been built in the inner city in a place like Cape Town. And that is a staggering figure. Like, you would imagine that one of the first efforts would have been to bring affordable housing in the inner city, where, it was an exclusive place for predominantly whites. So these are the kind of things that I think are the levers which need to change. Bring the question of land center of the planning regime, figure out a way in which spatial justice and spatial transformation can take place to integrate people living in wealthy, well-serviced areas with people, poor and working class people living on the periphery, and then build as much affordable housing in the inner city to equalize what the property markets and exclusionary markets, operated through, speculation, operated through Airbnb, through many of the other
mm,
things, market instruments that are currently operating in a place like South Africa.
mm. No, I think that's where I was going to go for the next question as well. But you mentioned something about evictions. Now, it kind of indirectly implies that if you are having people evict their place of residence, it's either two things. It's one, because they are either living there or residing there illegally, or you are evicting them because you have a certain kind of land ownership that you want to change the nature of, and you want to evict the people who are occupying that space. Uh, if you're already saying that there is a little bit of a housing crisis and affordable housing is something that hasn't been made available to people who it should be made available to, how do you think one can, in a place like Cape Town, address that issue without inherently looking at land ownership? So if you're saying that the apartheid regime, you had the whites occupying a certain part of the city and the blacks were living in dormitories or um, more crammed up dense areas, it kind of implies that the whites had a much larger portion of land that they owned, that they could not be forcefully evicted from, whereas the other people could be evicted from, right? And if you're now saying that it is the state governments or your local governments or your national governments owning larger part of these land banks without looking at ownership as an underlying issue or change in the ownership, how does one really look at the supply of housing, whether it's affordable housing, mid-income housing? So how are the two related, and how does policy or law come into play when you are trying to correlate the two?
Sure. That's a very complicated question to answer in easy ways. But so maybe to start with kind of where the housing debates, maybe to start at the top, like where the housing debates globally sit. In many ways, one of the victory that many of the kind of housing activists globally have hailed is their ability to create some very progressive constitutions in certain countries and certain very progressive laws in countries to prevent forced removals and illegal evictions. So I think that has been a major step forward in the preventative side of things. And these usually involve a number of aspects. So for instance, New York has free legal representation for people facing evictions. In South Africa, for instance, there's a law against any illegal evictions that does not go through a court process. So in a way, what the laws are defining is that the state should never have, government or even a private owner should never have impunity to enact an eviction without a court order, that there must be some form of an oversight to look at the legitimacy of the reason why people occupy land. And particularly in a place like South Africa, where people historically have been dispossessed, land occupation has always been an instrument to do land transformation. It's about like exerting power, exerting force against a very oppressive regime. So in the current context, what this means is that when the way the law is structured, which is called the Prevention of Illegal Eviction Act, really looks at what the responsibilities of state and private owner are, both in terms of preventative measures, which means going to a court, asking for a court order to evict a particular set of community that might have occupied a piece of land, but also the onus on the state to provide alternative accommodation, which means any eviction that renders people homeless and on the street
Hmm.
has to be avoided at all cost, because that's been the genealogy of the country. And so in many ways, any kind of eviction that would lead anyone to be living on the street will be prevented by the state having an obligation to provide alternative accommodation. Now, something like that is obviously easier said than done, because the amount of resources that you would require to evict the 3,000 odd informal settlements that exist in the country is enormous. Like, where would the people go? The amount of resources that would be required to house people. But it is part of a very clearly stated legal obligation. And many countries have a similar obligation that they've replicated, which is the onus of the state to provide alternative accommodation to people that face eviction. Now, in in many of these kind of debates around illegal evictions, the one aspect that hasn't been used in great detail is the issue of tenure security. And all of
Hmm.
this eventually boils down to tenure security. In a way, there are laws in places like Brazil, in Sao Paulo, in Buenos Aires, where the tenure security is determined by the duration of your occupation. So if you've been occupying land for a certain number of years, I think even India has similar laws.
Yeah.
If you've been occupying a land for unencumbered, without any legal cases, for a period of 10 years or 20 years,
You can lay
you're
claim to the, yeah.
you can lay claim to that piece of land. So, in many ways, there are different ways in which the tenure security is reinforced. In South Africa, specifically, the tenure security is bolstered by this particular law, which allows the state to go through the court process and provide alternative accommodation. Now, this hasn't resulted in the state or private property owners not enacting illegal evictions, which means forced removals based on gaps in things which the constitution or constitutional law can very seldom cover, things like what is a home.
Hmm.
So a good example is one of the evictions, in one of the affidavits by the anti-land invasion unit. One of the people that evicted a person said, I looked into the window, I didn't see a bed, I didn't see a mattress, I didn't see a stove, I just assumed that no one was living there, and I demolished the home. And so a lot of the
Hmm.
time, the state is asking for this power to determine what a home is, which is again a very, very vague description, because you get caught into this kind of legal circular arguments about define what a home is. If you don't know what a home is, then who determines it? Can the police determine what a home is? Can the state determine who the home is? Do the courts need? So it makes the matter very, very complicated when it comes to kind of understanding the legalities of this. I think the broad basis of understanding the history of colonial practice of dispossession implores us to understand that evictions and dispossession are inherently bad and they are destructive. So, what the families experience, on the other hand, and UN Habitat has documented some incredible documents on the actual cost of evictions. It's not just the loss of your home, it's not just the loss of your material property, it's the loss of your ID cards, your chronic medications, your ability to
Hmm.
stay in a particular neighborhood that has access to economic or other social amenities. So the loss, when you kind of start accumulating, and the dispossession that you start accumulating keeps repeating itself in cycles for people who are poor and marginalized, and it creates this kind of stereotype of understanding poverty as people who are living on the street, or pavement dwellers, or people living in slums or informal settlements, and so on. So in many ways, if you were to boil down this debate and move it out of the kind of concept of eviction, you really have to look, and like you mentioned, the question of land has to be front and center of this.
Hmm.
Both the question of public land, whether it's the sale of public land to the private sector, whether it's long-term lease to the private sector to develop, large complexes, malls, big exclusionary developments of condominiums and things like that, or whether it's private land, which must have conditions around how we use our development rights. How do we use the FAR, which is awarded by the state to a private developer to do certain things? And I think there are some really good examples that are being tested in Cape Town around how private developers could have conditions attached to their development approval and their planning approval,
Hmm.
which forces them to think of broader consequences on the city rather than just looking at the development and the economics and the numbers that determine how one particular development and one particular building interacts. So, in a way, compelling developers to make contributions towards affordability or contributions towards other social housing that may be developed in the inner city and so on. So, without having the stopgaps into the market forces that determine how housing is shaped in a city, there's very little incentive for the state to reform the housing crisis. So you have to put those planning measures in place to be able to unlock a different type of potential of the market to perform in the favor of majority of the people rather than the minority.
Hmm. What's interesting is to see this kind of as like a cyclical problem where land ownership and law policy are kind of chasing each other, because the policy impacts the development, but the development also impacts the policy. And what is also kind of striking is how different the definition of a home is when you're legally talking about it and kind of boiling it down to a list or your bullet points or kind of a very objective outlook. And I was just recently reading Toni Morrison's essay on home, and the way you look at it outside of the legal language, it's described very emotionally, very poetically, and then you kind of condense it into these items and these things to fit within the legal framework. But speaking of that, Adi, I think your journey personally also has been very interesting, because you've transitioned from working with the big architectural agency to focusing more on the grassroots effort. If you could talk a little bit about your work, your journey, how did this shift kind of happen, and what are you up to right now?
Yeah, so my journey is started with architecture. So I studied architecture and finished in the late 90s and quickly got into internships and practice around looking at a residential practice, looking at interior design and small
The usual
renovation,
stuff, yeah.
the usual stuff.
Yeah.
And I mean, I quickly kind of like got a taste for that type of work and realized that that type of design wasn't for me. I wasn't kind of meant to work with this kind of client relationship where the
Yeah.
client, who has money determines these kind of things. So I wanted to break out of that norm, and a big earthquake happened in Gujarat in 2001, and uh, the day it happened, the next day, I had a kind of dream at night, sort of, and a kind of lightning bolt in my head saying, like, you must go and work there. That's what you must do. And so I became kind of obsessed with this idea of like going to Gujarat post earthquake, trying to do some reconstruction work, and I found some avenues through an architecture company and decided to go there and test myself. And I hadn't necessarily even built a single house before I landed up there with like the task of trying to build 250 homes in this village. And so it was a intellectually and from a professional perspective a huge challenge for me to leap. How do you do this at scale, and how do you build quick, fast with the people, bringing them along? So it unfolded in a series of kind of participatory processes. And, we not only built the 250 odd houses, we ended up building close to about like 1,600 homes in 2 years and about 3,000 sanitation units in rapid fire pace with, I had a small team of like 6 people or something like that. And we managed to keep track of all the houses being built across these 6 villages, spread out over 80 kilometers. So while the participatory process is very unique, I realize in hindsight that like that was perhaps the wrong way of doing participatory work. It in itself, it's we had to take certain choices, and the choices in hindsight were not all appropriate, because inevitably what we ended up doing was reinforcing lines of caste and religion in the villages, which was
Mm.
very dominant at that place. Also, the complication of building at that pace meant that you had to play a lot of kind of political games between contractors, between the large charity that was financing it, the local committees and the leadership structures in the villages. So it meant you had to embrace power in very awkward ways. So I mean, I would do it very differently if I was to do something like that. So that experience really defined for me a different practice around how to do participatory builds, how to do participatory design. And I honestly learned the hard way. So I spent about 5 years after this experience in the US. So I did a master's in scenario and strategic planning, looking at particularly metropolitan and city planning, and then worked on affordable housing in Los Angeles. And again, learned in that experience that affordable housing in many of the global north countries is very insular compared to the kind of housing work that we do in the global south, where it's all about the people. The global north housing is about finding a piece of land, developing something, putting a building up there, and people applying for a lottery and getting in there. So it's this kind of faceless, nameless type of developments, but still very useful experience to understand how the financing and the planning aspects of affordable housing is structured.
Hmm.
I've moved and worked, did a lot of work around kind of planning through a corporate firm in the Boston area, which was a really interesting experience for me. I learned a lot, but I also learned that this developer driven model is the real driver and force behind how our cities are shaping. They
Hmm.
are It's the developers that are determining what develops in our city. It's never the spatial vision of the city. It's never what the state wants. It's never what the people want. It's always determined by how the property markets and the property developers determine what is good
Yeah.
for revenue generation and the balance sheet and so on. So while it was very rewarding and exploratory for me, I quickly realized that, this type of planning itself and this type of design that works with with the niche market of like property developers isn't for me. So after probably about like at least about 500 applications in different development agencies, I ended up moving to Lebanon. And so I spent 2 years there in Lebanon working on the reconstruction of a Palestinian refugee camp. And there, thanks to a number of incredible activists and incredible people who were working there, we managed to do something quite extraordinary in the way of using people's memories, people's cultural identity as a way of determining how would you reconstruct a Palestinian refugee camp that's destroyed in war, and so relevant in the context of what is happening in the world at the moment. So in a way, that was a moment, I guess, in my own professional journey to really understand like how to use design and planning as an instrument of change,
Hmm.
but not just for shelter and home and building those kind of things, but really as an instrument of organizing communities, of helping people regain power, and as a result force a different type of democracy or a different type of interaction with state institutions or with the private sector. So I really wanted to deepen this idea of how to organize and how to use planning and design as an instrument for that kind of change. And in South Africa, I spent probably the first 5 years looking at slum upgrading and really developing different tools and different techniques around uh, how to do upgrading when people are living on the land. So how do you do in situ upgrading when you have densities approaching
Hmm.
450, 500 dwelling units per hectare? So how do you operate in that sector? And also, how do you leverage municipal finance to do the type of upgrading that the people want to see in their own settlements? So I think that was a very unique experience in understanding that upgrading has many different ways of thinking about it, and it could mean a drainage system, it could mean incredible play park, it could mean new sanitation facilities, it could mean access to water, it could mean a myriad of things from roads, infrastructure, community facilities, and so on. So probably tested every possible aspect of type of upgrading that you could do, both in Cape Town, but also in some of the other cities in Johannesburg and so on, and translating some of these ideas in Nairobi and in other places, really helped me understand what working with the grassroots could look like, what
Hmm.
a proper system, an ethical system, and a morally and ethically sound system of working with people could look like. And then probably the last 8 or 10 years, I've really kind of stepped up into a more executive role, running different nonprofit organizations,
Hmm.
and both doing very interesting work, both around uh, working with micro developers, people who building small scale rental units, or working on the issue of land, or organizations that are compelling the private sector to have a contribution towards affordable housing, or working on tenure security around pieces of land that have been historically occupied for the last 30, 40 years and compelling the state to release that piece of land. So those kind of campaigns have only come in fruition once you've been through the washing machine of doing all these experiences, and that
Mm-hmm.
really in understanding how the inner workings of the state and the inner workings of the private sector interact with the grassroots, and what are the kind of advocacy and pressure points that exist in the sector to really transform what our urban space looks like.
Well, if you had one piece of advice or guidance for any young architect who wants to pivot into the kind of grassroots, nonprofit activism role and move from the building object scale to the scale at which you are working, what would you say to them? How does one shift gears?
uh, I would think the biggest shift and gear is I would say passion, persistence, and self-care.
Hmm.
Passion is the core of this thing. I think if you're not passionate about this topic, you'll end up in like a large multilateral agency and push papers. But if you're really interested in substantial change, then you have to you have to go where your heart tells you to go. So I think passion is important. I think persistence is critical because often this sector is very demoralizing. There's a lot
Mm.
of value and experience, but there's also a lot of power play around, like who
Yeah.
says what and who operates what, and self identity around, like, oh, that person is an activist. Is he really an activist? Is he just playing the market? That kind of thing. So I think those identity politics you have to persist through, and also persist through the complications of getting into that space and interacting with the right kind of stakeholders. And then obviously, like, it's really really critical to have these pieces of passion and persistence interact with each other, so that you look after yourself, because this sector is very self-absorbing. I mean, I have worked in South Africa, in Lebanon, sometimes 14, 15. So, and often people underestimate not just the hours that you put in, but also what you see in front of you. I mean, seeing people living without access to water or
Mm.
sanitation, or without a home in the kind of conditions that we see in many cities across the world, in flooded areas and so on. That impact is very cumulative, and so self-care in the development sector is hugely important, because people just get lost and become cynical, and then
Mm.
it becomes difficult to justify why to do this work if your mind is so cynical around the passion that you started with. So
Yeah.
be passionate, be persistent, and look after yourself while you're doing this type of work, because it's hard.
Well, that's a lovely note to end this on. Thank you so much, Adi, for sharing your insights and your experience, and we wish you all the best for your venture. Special thanks to Ayushi Thakur for the research and design support, and Kahan Shah for the background score. You can follow us on Instagram at Arc of Center and reach out to us through our website arcofcenter.com. That is ARCHOFFCENTRE. And thanks for listening.